My dad read through my foster brother's stolen school records at breakfast, mocking the intervention notes and warning me he was dangerous. But when I begged him to stop, he just snapped back. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday, I received a blank letter from Rico that left me shaken. Okay, you're not going to believe the nightmare that unfolded in our home. A nightmare engineered with chilling precision by a high school kid. It's a story about how easily a system meant to protect the vulnerable can be twisted into a weapon, and how one incredible kid fought back against an invisible enemy determined to destroy him. It all started when I was 15, and my parents decided to foster this 14-year-old boy, Rico. The social worker gave us the whole rundown, 3 homes already, behavioral issues with authority figures. My mom, bless her heart, kept asking what challenging really meant, while my dad, already skeptical, remembered the last family called him aggressive. But my mom was on a full-blown savior complex kick, so Rico came to live with us. When he arrived, Rico was this quiet kid who barely said 2 words at dinner. My parents, though, didn't see shyness. They saw attitude. They saw someone planning something. Within a week, it was like they'd already decided Rico was trouble waiting to happen. Dad nitpicked his every move. Mom hovered constantly. They even made him keep his bedroom door open all the time and check in every hour. It was suffocating. School wasn't much better. Teachers had obviously been briefed on his issues, and I watched them give him detention for things other kids got. Warnings for he ate lunch alone and no one would partner with him for projects. But honestly, this kid, Rico, was the most harmless person you could imagine. He'd pick up dropped books for kids without being asked, always held doors open. When our neighbor's cat went missing, Rico spent hours looking for it, completely unprompted. He was just good. The real test came about a month later. I was walking home from school when this group of older high school kids cornered me behind the gas station. They weren't trying to hurt me, not physically, but they definitely wanted my phone and wallet. I was getting seriously scared, my heart pounding when Rico just appeared around the corner, groceries for my mom in his arms. He didn't even hesitate. He walked right up, calm as anything, and asked if everything was okay. The lead kid sized Rico up, and I guess decided it wasn't worth the trouble. They just left. Rico walked me home, and we talked the whole way. It was the first real conversation we'd ever had. You'd think my parents would be grateful, right? That he helped me? Nope. Not even a little bit. Mom immediately started questioning why Rico was even in that area, if he'd been following me. Dad, God help him, launched into this whole thing about how kids with his background are drawn to conflict and probably escalated the situation. They called his social worker that very night, expressing concerns about his behavior. 2 days later, the worker had a serious talk with Rico about appropriate boundaries, even though he literally just walked me home safely. It was infuriating. Things only got worse. Word spread at school that Rico had gotten into a fight defending me, which wasn't even true. Teachers started watching him like a hawk. Some parents actually complained to the principal about having a violent student. Kids who used to just ignore him now actively avoided him, their faces full of fear. And my parents? They just saw all this as confirmation. Rico attracted trouble wherever he went. One evening, I found Rico crying in the basement while he was supposed to be doing homework. He was trying to hide it, but his shoulders were shaking. I just sat with him, and eventually, he opened up. He told me about his previous placements. Turns out, he'd never been aggressive. In his first home, the foster dad was abusive, hitting Rico for small mistakes. When Rico told his social worker, he was labeled as making up stories. His second home, the foster parents favored their biological kids and blamed Rico for everything. In the third, the foster mom's boyfriend made inappropriate comments, and again, when Rico reported it, no one believed him. Each time he tried to defend himself or speak up, he became the problem child. His social worker was already talking about moving him to a group home because my parents were expressing doubts. Rico looked at me with these tired, defeated eyes and said I was the first person in months who treated him like a normal kid. Then his expression shifted, a worried look settling in. He said there was something he needed to tell me about those guys who cornered me. He explained that one of them had been asking around school about me specifically, and he was afraid they might try again. He wanted to show me something he'd found out about them and asked me to meet him by the old oak tree after school tomorrow. I agreed, though a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The next afternoon, Rico was already waiting by the oak tree, constantly checking his phone, glancing around like he expected someone to jump out. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone to show me something. He scrolled through screenshots, and with each one, my blood ran colder. There were messages between students I barely knew, asking detailed questions about my family. What time did Dad leave? Did Mom work from home? What car did we drive? Someone had even taken photos of our house from different angles. The lead bully from the gas station, a guy named Zach, seemed to be coordinating everything. Rico showed me more screenshots. Zach systematically gathering information from the school directory, social media posts, casual conversations. This wasn't just random teenage harassment. Zach was building detailed profiles, documenting our routines, our relationships, with disturbing precision. Then Rico dropped the biggest bomb. He hadn't just randomly shown up with groceries that day. He'd been following me for 3 days because Zach's friends had been asking younger kids about my schedule, trying to figure out when I'd be alone. Rico had been trying to protect me without making it obvious. But now, he realized how creepy that sounded. The truth made him look like a stalker, even though his intentions were pure. My mind was racing. Rico revealed even more. Somehow, Zach had gotten contact information for Rico's previous foster mother. He'd been calling her, pretending to be concerned about Rico's well-being, saying Rico was in trouble again, and collecting any negative stories she might share. Rico's voice cracked as he explained how his old foster mom had called him, crying and confused about why strangers were asking about his past. We both froze. Rico spotted movement near the parking lot. Zach. He was there, watching my house from a different spot than yesterday. He'd adapted his surveillance after we'd noticed him. Rico grabbed my arm, pulling me behind the tree, but it was too late. Zach had seen us. He was walking over with a confident, sickening smile. Zach approached with fake friendliness, introducing himself to me like we'd never met. His phone was clearly recording in his shirt pocket. He extended his hand for a handshake. He kept making comments designed to provoke Rico, asking about his anger management issues and whether he was adjusting well to his new placement. Rico remained completely calm on the surface, but I could see his hands trembling at his sides. This was pure psychological warfare. Zach would say something inflammatory, then immediately follow with reasonable-sounding words, creating a pattern, where any defensive response from Rico would look aggressive on video. When Rico didn't react, Zach escalated, mentioning how he was looking forward to meeting my parents and discussing their admirable commitment to helping troubled youth. I tried to record the conversation on my phone, but the battery died, just as I opened the camera app. Zach noticed and smirked, pulling out a portable charger from his pocket, offering it to me with exaggerated politeness. Everything about him was calculated, prepared. He was always one step ahead. After Zach finally left, Rico broke down. He admitted Zach reminded him of his second foster father, someone who'd enjoyed psychological manipulation and always stayed just within legal boundaries. That man had made Rico's life hell while maintaining a perfect public image, and Rico was terrified of going through that again. At dinner that night, Dad casually mentioned receiving a concerned call from someone named Mrs. Henderson about Rico following her son around school. My stomach dropped. Zach's last name was Henderson. He'd already recruited his mother as an ally, positioning his harassment campaign as protective concern. Mom immediately started questioning whether we really knew enough about Rico's background. Over the next few days, I uncovered the extent of Zach's digital manipulation. He'd created fake social media accounts using information gathered from yearbooks and student directories, impersonating various students to spread rumors and gather more information. The level of organization was disturbing for a high school student. Rico received another call from his previous foster mother. Someone had convinced her to share stories about Rico's violent episodes that had never actually happened, twisting normal teenage frustrations into signs of dangerous behavior. She was crying, apologizing, saying she didn't mean to cause trouble, but the caller had been so convincing about needing to protect other children. My college prep counselor pulled me aside after class, mentioning she'd received concerning reports about my judgment and friendships. Someone had suggested my association with Rico might reflect poorly on my early admission applications. The conversation was framed as helpful advice, but the threat was clear. The school resource officer even stopped by our lunch table, casually asking if I felt safe around Rico. He made it seem like a routine check-in, but Rico and I both knew someone had filed an official concern report. The system was being weaponized against us, and we were just teenagers trying to navigate it. I spent hours searching Zach's name online, finding only vague references to family difficulties and a change of schools. No specifics, just hints about the situation and what happened with that foster kid. The posts were old, from a different school district, but they painted a picture of something serious. Through careful social media investigation, cross-referencing old posts and tagged photos, I found discussions from Zach's previous school community. Multiple posts mentioned someone named Marcel in connection with a foster care situation. The name was familiar, and then it hit me. Rico had mentioned a Marcel when talking about his first foster home. The pieces started falling into place. One post mentioned the Henderson brothers and their family tragedy. Another referenced what happened with Marcel and that foster kid. The timestamp suggested this occurred about 2 years ago, around the time Rico left his first placement. I confronted Rico with what I'd found. His face went pale when I mentioned Marcel's name. After a long silence, he finally explained. Marcel had been his foster brother in the first home, the only person who'd tried to protect Rico from their abusive foster father. But when Rico finally reported the abuse, Marcel got blamed for not preventing it, for not being a good enough influence. The truth was even worse than I'd imagined. Zach was Marcel's biological younger brother. When Marcel's mental health deteriorated after being scapegoated for the abuse Rico suffered, Zach blamed Rico entirely. This wasn't random bullying or typical teenage cruelty. This was a calculated revenge plot, years in the making. Rico explained that Marcel had ended up in psychiatric treatment after the investigation. His relationship with his family was destroyed. Zach had spent years nursing his hatred, researching where Rico might be placed, and specifically choosing our school district when his family moved. He'd come here with one purpose: to destroy Rico's life the way he believed Rico had destroyed Marcel's. Understanding Zach's motivation made everything scarier. This wasn't about power or entertainment. Zach would never stop because in his mind he was avenging his brother. He'd turned his grief and anger into a methodical campaign of destruction. Rico broke down completely, realizing he'd inadvertently brought danger to my family just by being placed with us. He talked about requesting a transfer, moving to a group home, anything to protect us from Zach's vendetta. But we both knew running wouldn't solve anything. Zach would just follow him to the next placement and the next. The next morning, I woke up to find a manila envelope shoved under our front door. Inside were printed screenshots of Rico's school records from his previous districts, highlighting every detention, every incident report, every counselor's note, all taken out of context. Zach had somehow accessed confidential files and was leaving them like breadcrumbs for my parents to find. Mom discovered the envelope first and spent breakfast poring over the documents with Dad. They exchanged worried glances while Rico sat frozen at the table, watching his past being dissected by people who were supposed to protect him. I tried, explaining that the records were stolen and manipulated, but my parents were too focused on phrases like behavioral intervention and anger management recommended to listen. Rico excused himself and went to his room. I followed and found him packing his few belongings into a garbage bag. He explained that he recognized this pattern, that soon the pressure would become too much for my parents, and they'd request his removal anyway. Better to leave on his own terms than wait for another rejection. I convinced him to stay for now, but the damage was spreading. At school, I noticed parents whispering in the pickup line, their eyes following Rico. 3. Different teachers suddenly needed to reorganize seating charts, always resulting in Rico being moved away from other students. Zach's campaign expanded beyond just targeting Rico. His friends started approaching my classmates, asking if I'd been acting differently lately, if I seemed obsessed with defending someone dangerous. They planted seeds of doubt about my judgment, my stability, my motivations for protecting Rico. The first staged incident happened during PE class. One of Zach's friends pretended to trip near Rico, then screamed that Rico had pushed him. The gym teacher hadn't seen what actually happened, but with Rico's manufactured reputation, the assumption was automatic. Rico got sent to the principal's office while Zach's friend received sympathy and an ice pack for his fake injury. More staged situations followed over the next week. A calculator went missing from someone's backpack after Rico walked past. Someone's homework got torn up in a classroom where Rico had been sitting alone. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to look accidental, to seem like Rico was either clumsy, careless, or deliberately destructive. I started documenting everything in a notebook, writing down times, dates, and witnesses. But when I reviewed my notes, I realized how paranoid they looked. Pages of observations about Zach's movements, his friends' behaviors, their coordination patterns. Anyone reading it would think I was the one with problems. Rico's emotional state deteriorated rapidly. He stopped eating lunch, stopped doing homework, stopped participating in class, even when teachers directly called on him. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, trying to take up as little space as possible, to give no one any reason to notice or report him. Then, Zach escalated to involving more adults. His mother called the school requesting a meeting about safety concerns. She arrived with a folder of printed emails from concerned parents who'd heard about Rico's violent history. The emails were all from accounts created in the last week, but the principal didn't check that detail. During the meeting, Mrs. Henderson performed the role of reasonable, concerned parent flawlessly. She acknowledged that foster children deserve chances, but questioned whether the school was equipped to handle someone with Rico's complex behavioral needs. She suggested maybe Rico would be better served in an alternative education program. The principal assured her they were monitoring the situation, which meant Rico now had an administrator watching his every move. Any normal teenage behavior, frustration at a difficult assignment, tiredness from poor sleep, reluctance to participate in group work, got documented as potential warning signs. I tried talking to my parents about what was really happening, but they were caught between wanting to help Rico and fearing the social consequences. Mom mentioned how several neighbors had expressed concerns about having a troubled foster child in the neighborhood. Dad's coworker had asked if we'd installed better locks since taking in a teen with authority issues. The psychological pressure was relentless. Zach had turned our entire community into a surveillance network, everyone watching Rico for signs of the violence they'd been told to expect. The tragic irony was that Rico was probably the gentlest person I'd ever met, but gentleness looks like weakness when everyone's expecting aggression. One afternoon, I discovered Zach had been visiting the middle school, talking to younger students about staying safe around older kids with violent histories. He'd created an entire mythology around Rico, stories that got more elaborate with each telling. By the time they reached the elementary school, kids were crossing the street to avoid walking past our house. Rico overheard some of these stories when we walked past a group of middle schoolers. His face crumpled as he heard himself described as someone who attacked teachers, destroyed property, threatened other foster kids. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own. That night, Rico showed me old photos from his first foster home. Pictures of him helping Marcel with homework, both of them smiling at a birthday party, normal kids having normal moments. He explained how Marcel had tried to shield him from their foster father's rage, often taking punishments meant for Rico. The guilt of Marcel's sacrifice had haunted Rico ever since. Understanding this context made Zach's revenge even crueler. He was using Rico's trauma and guilt as weapons, recreating the same patterns of blame and isolation that had destroyed Rico's previous placements. Zach knew exactly which buttons to push because he'd studied his brother's breakdown in detail. The mediation meeting Zach's mother arranged was a masterpiece of manipulation. She arrived with Zach and his father, all dressed professionally, and radiating concern. My parents had reluctantly agreed to attend, hoping to resolve the misunderstandings. Zach played his role flawlessly. He spoke softly about wanting everyone to feel safe, about his own family's experiences with the foster system, about the importance of proper support for troubled youth. Every word was carefully chosen to sound compassionate while implying Rico was dangerous. When my parents tried to defend Rico, Zach's father shared his own story about Marcel's struggles, how one foster child's accusations had destroyed their family. He painted Rico as a manipulator who'd turned their son against them, who'd created chaos and then disappeared, leaving them to pick up the pieces. Rico sat through the entire meeting in silence, his hands folded in his lap, making himself as small as possible. Each word from the Henderson family was another weight on his shoulders, another reminder that his existence caused pain wherever he went. I watched him disappear into himself, the spark in his eyes dimming with each passing minute. After the meeting, my parents were shaken. The Hendersons had been so reasonable, so articulate, so genuinely concerned. Mom started wondering aloud if we were equipped to handle Rico's needs. Dad mentioned that maybe a group home with professional staff would be better for everyone. I felt the walls closing in on Rico from all sides. The school saw him as a threat. The community feared him, and now even my parents were wavering. Zach had orchestrated a perfect storm of suspicion and doubt, all while maintaining his image as a concerned, mature young man. The breaking point came when I discovered Zach had been recording our conversations and editing them to make Rico sound aggressive. He'd splice together words from different sentences, remove context, and add dramatic music. The videos spread through private group chats, each one reinforcing the narrative of Rico as unstable and dangerous. I confronted Zach privately, hoping to reason with him or at least understand his endgame. He dropped his perfect student act and revealed the depth of his obsession. He showed me notebooks filled with information about Rico, detailed plans for each stage of his campaign, contingency strategies for different scenarios. Zach explained that he'd spent 2 years planning this, researching foster care placement patterns, studying social manipulation techniques, learning how bureaucratic systems could be weaponized. He'd chosen our school district specifically because Rico was here, moving his entire family for the chance at revenge. The level of premeditation was terrifying. This wasn't teenage bullying or impulsive cruelty. This was a methodical campaign of destruction carried out by someone who'd turned their pain into a weapon. Zach believed destroying Rico would somehow heal his brother, would balance some cosmic scale of justice. I realized then that evidence wouldn't matter, truth wouldn't matter. Zach had created a reality where Rico was guilty by default, where every action could be twisted into proof of danger. The community had already accepted this narrative, and changing their minds would be nearly impossible. Rico started having panic attacks, his body finally rebelling against the constant stress. I found him hyperventilating in the bathroom one morning, convinced that today would be the day he got removed. He'd been through this pattern too many times, knew how it ended, and was just waiting for the inevitable. My attempts to help were making things worse. Teachers noticed me defending Rico and started questioning my judgment. My college counselor suggested I might be too emotionally invested in a situation I couldn't control. Even my closest friends started avoiding me, not wanting to get pulled into the drama. The isolation was part of Zach's strategy. By targeting anyone who showed Rico kindness, he ensured Rico would remain alone and vulnerable. Support systems were systematically dismantled until Rico had nowhere to turn, no one to trust, no hope for things improving. Then came the anonymous reports to Child Protective Services. Multiple calls about concerns for my safety, about inappropriate relationships between foster and biological children, about my parents' failure to maintain proper boundaries. Each report was vague enough to require investigation, but specific enough to sound credible. The CPS investigator arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She interviewed each of us separately, asking probing questions about sleeping arrangements, supervision, physical contact, and emotional boundaries. The questions were routine for her, but each one felt like an accusation. Rico shut down completely during his interview. He answered in monosyllables, his voice flat and mechanical. Years of not being believed had taught him that defending himself only made things worse. He'd learned to become invisible, to offer nothing that could be twisted against him. My parents were devastated by the investigation. They'd opened their home to help a child in need, and now they were being treated like potential abusers. The investigator found no evidence of wrongdoing, but she noted the concerning pattern of reports and recommended increased monitoring of the placement. This bureaucratic victory was exactly what Zach wanted. Not removal, not immediate action, but ongoing scrutiny that would slowly poison the placement. Every interaction would now be shadowed by the possibility of misinterpretation. Every normal family moment fraught with potential risk. Rico became a shell of himself after the CPS visit. He followed every rule to the letter, never spoke unless directly asked a question, and spent most of his time in his room staring at nothing. He'd survived by shutting down before, and he was doing it again. I watched this transformation with growing anger and helplessness. Zach had won without ever laying a finger on Rico, had destroyed him using the very systems meant to protect vulnerable children. The elegance of the cruelty was almost admirable if it weren't so horrifying. My grades started slipping as I spent more time trying to document Zach's harassment. I created spreadsheets of incidents, timelines of reports, charts showing the coordination between different attacks. But the more evidence I gathered, the more obsessed I looked. One night, I found myself considering planting evidence against Zach, maybe creating fake messages or staging my own incidents to expose him. The thought terrified me because I realized I was becoming capable of the same manipulation I was fighting against. Zach's poison was spreading, turning me into someone I didn't recognize. Rico noticed my spiral and tried to convince me to stop. He said he'd survived worse, that he appreciated my help, but didn't want me destroying my own life for his sake. His resignation broke my heart more than any of Zach's attacks. The placement review meeting was scheduled for the following month. Rico knew what that meant, had been through enough reviews to recognize when a placement was failing. He started emotionally preparing to leave, withdrawing even more to make the eventual separation easier. I made one last desperate attempt to find evidence that would expose Zach definitively. I reached out to Marcel through social media, hoping he might provide insight or testimony about his brother's obsession. It was a violation of boundaries I never would have considered before all this started. Marcel responded with a long message explaining his family's dysfunction, how his parents had enabled Zach's fixation on revenge, how they'd moved multiple times following Rico's placements. He wanted to help, but was terrified of his family's reaction if he spoke out. The moral complexity of the situation hit me hard. Marcel was another victim in this tragedy, someone whose mental health had been shattered by circumstances beyond his control. Using him to save Rico might cause him more harm, perpetuating the cycle of destruction. Rico discovered I'd contacted Marcel, and we had our first real fight. He accused me of treating him like a project, of violating his foster brother's privacy, of becoming as manipulative as the people we were fighting. His words stung because they held truth I didn't want to acknowledge. The argument revealed how much the situation had corrupted both of us. I'd started with pure intentions, but had gradually justified increasingly questionable actions. Rico had been so struck down by the system that he'd rather accept injustice than risk causing more harm to others. Zach noticed our conflict immediately and adjusted his tactics. He started targeting me directly, suggesting to teachers and counselors that I had an unhealthy fixation on Rico. The narrative shifted from Rico being dangerous to me being unstable, obsessed with defending someone who didn't want my help. My parents began expressing concerns about my behavior. They noticed the notebooks full of documentation, the hours spent researching Zach's background, the way I'd isolated myself from former friends. From their perspective, I was destroying my future for someone who'd brought nothing but trouble to our family. The genius of Zach's strategy became clear. He'd created a situation where fighting back looked like mental illness, where gathering evidence appeared obsessive, where loyalty seemed like unhealthy attachment. Every move we made to defend ourselves only reinforced the narrative he'd created. As the placement review meeting approached, I faced an impossible choice. I could present my evidence and risk looking unstable, potentially making things worse for Rico, or I could stay silent and watch him get moved to another placement where Zach would undoubtedly follow. Rico made the choice for me. He requested to speak at the review meeting, saying he wanted to advocate for himself for once. His quiet dignity in the face of systematic destruction gave me hope that maybe, finally, someone would see the truth. but I knew Zach would be prepared for this. 2. He'd have contingencies, new accusations, more sophisticated manipulations ready to deploy. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase, and we were already exhausted from battles we'd lost. The night before the review meeting, I sat with Rico in his room, both of us knowing everything was about to change. We didn't talk about strategies or evidence or fighting back. We just sat in silence, two teenagers overwhelmed by forces beyond our control. Outside, I noticed a car parked across the street, someone watching our house. Whether it was Zach gathering more surveillance or just my paranoia seeing threats everywhere, I couldn't tell anymore. The line between reasonable caution and paranoid delusion had been deliberately blurred. As I prepared for bed, I realized this was what Zach had wanted all along. Not just Rico's removal, but the complete destruction of trust, hope, and human connection. He'd turned kindness into liability, compassion into weakness, and truth into subjective interpretation. Tomorrow would bring the review meeting, new battles, and probably more defeats. But tonight I made a decision. I would stop trying to hit Zach at his own game. Instead, I would simply be present for Rico, offering friendship without agenda, support without strategy. It wasn't much against Zach's elaborate campaign, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the answer to systematic cruelty wasn't more systems and strategies, but simple human connection that refused to be broken. I knew Zach would have something planned for the review meeting, but I wasn't prepared for the level of documentation he'd assembled. The morning of the meeting, another envelope appeared under our door. This time, it contained Marcel's actual medical records from his psychiatric treatment, with certain sections highlighted to show how his breakdown coincided with Rico's placement in their home. The violation of Marcel's privacy made my stomach turn. Zach had weaponized his own brother's mental health crisis, turning Marcel's pain into ammunition against Rico. My parents read through the documents with growing alarm, seeing official medical terminology that seemed to confirm everything the Hendersons had claimed. Rico found me holding the papers and immediately understood what they were. His face went completely white as he recognized Marcel's handwriting on some of the intake forms. The guilt that crashed over him was almost physical, making him stumble backward into the wall. I watched Rico struggle with the weight of seeing Marcel's suffering documented in clinical terms. Every diagnosis, every medication adjustment, every therapy note represented pain that Rico blamed himself for causing. The fact that none of it was actually his fault didn't matter to his traumatized mind. The review meeting was set for 3 hours. Rico spent the morning in his room, and I could hear him practicing what he wanted to say. His voice was steady, but hollow, like he was reading lines for a play he didn't want to be in. I realized he wasn't preparing to fight for his placement anymore. He was preparing to say goodbye. Mom and Dad had a hushed conversation over lunch that Rico and I both pretended not to hear. They were discussing options and what's best for everyone, in the coded language adults use when they think kids aren't listening. The decision had already been made in their minds. The meeting was just a formality. An hour before we had to leave, I made a decision that went against everything I'd been trying to do. I gathered all my documentation, all my evidence of Zach's harassment campaign, and I burned it in the backyard fire pit. Rico watched from his window as months of obsessive note-taking turned to ash. The act felt like surrender, but also like clarity. I'd been so focused on proving Zach's manipulation that I'd lost sight of what actually mattered. Rico didn't need me to win some elaborate battle against Zach. He needed someone to see him as more than a problem to be solved or a victim to be saved. We arrived at the CPS office to find the Hendersons already there. Zach had brought a 3-ring binder labeled "Safety Concerns" in neat handwriting. His parents flanked him like bodyguards, their faces masks of reasonable worry. Mrs. Henderson even reached out to shake my mother's hand, performing civility while orchestrating destruction. The meeting room was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. Rico's social worker was there along with a supervisor I'd never seen before. The presence of additional authority meant this was serious, that decisions had already been discussed in meetings we weren't invited to. Rico was asked to wait outside while the adults talked first. I insisted on staying with him, which earned me looks of concern from everyone except Rico. We sat on hard plastic chairs, in the hallway, listening to muffled voices, discussing his future like he wasn't even a person. Zach emerged from the meeting room after 20 minutes, having delivered whatever presentation he'd prepared. He paused when he saw us, and for just a moment his mask slipped. I saw exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that maintaining his campaign had taken. But the moment passed, and his satisfied smile returned. When Rico was finally called in, I tried to follow, but the supervisor gently suggested I wait outside. Rico squeezed my hand before going in, a gesture that said everything we couldn't put into words. I pressed my ear against the door, but could only hear mumbling. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. I know because I counted every second, watching the institutional clock tick away what might be my last moments with Rico in our home. When the door opened, Rico walked out with his shoulders straight, but his eyes empty. My parents emerged, looking relieved and guilty in equal measure. The social worker was already talking about transition planning and finding the right therapeutic environment. The Hendersons left quickly, their mission accomplished. Nobody asked me what I thought. The ride home was silent, except for the social worker's car following us. She would be supervising Rico while he packed, making sure he only took what belonged to him. The assumption that he might steal from us was just another small cruelty in a long series of them. Rico packed methodically, folding each piece of clothing with military precision. He'd done this before, knew how to fit his life into garbage bags and pretend it didn't hurt. I helped him gather his school supplies, both of us avoiding eye contact because looking at each other would mean acknowledging what was happening. The social worker kept checking her phone and sighing, clearly wanting to get this over with. She'd probably done a dozen removals this month, and Rico was just another case number to process. My parents hovered in the doorway, offering help, that nobody wanted. Rico paused when he found the photos from his first foster home, the ones of him and Marcel. His hands shook as he decided whether to take them or leave them behind. I watched him tuck them carefully into his backpack, preserving the only good memories from that placement. I remembered something hidden in my room and ran to get it. The notebook where I'd written down all the good things about Rico, all the moments that showed who he really was beneath the labels and accusations. I pressed it into his hands without explanation. Rico flipped through a few pages, his eyes widening as he read my observations about his kindness, his strength, his quiet courage. For the first time since the meeting, something like hope flickered in his expression. He hugged the notebook to his chest like armor against what was coming. The group home was a 40-minute drive away. The social worker agreed to let me ride along, though she warned me I wouldn't be able to visit without approval and background checks. My parents seemed relieved they wouldn't have to do the drive themselves. Rico stared out the window as familiar streets gave way to unfamiliar ones. Each mile was taking him further from the closest thing to stability he'd had in years. I wanted to promise I'd visit, that I'd keep fighting for him, but the words felt hollow against the reality of the system. The group home was a converted office building with bars on the windows and a security desk in the lobby. Rico would be sharing a room with 3 other boys, eating cafeteria food, following a schedule designed to manage difficult teenagers. It was better than the streets, but worse than a home. The intake process was humiliating. Rico had to empty his pockets, surrender his phone, submit to a pat-down search. They cataloged his belongings like evidence, making him sign forms acknowledging the rules and consequences. I watched him disappear into himself, becoming the ghost he'd been when he first arrived at our house. A staff member with tired eyes and a laminated badge led Rico to his unit. I wasn't allowed to follow, had to say goodbye in the sterile lobby while the security guard pretended not to watch. Rico hugged me quickly, whispering that this wasn't my fault, that I'd done more than anyone ever had. The ride home with the social worker was awkward. She tried to make conversation about how the group home had good programs, how Rico would get the support he needed. I stared out the window and thought about Zach, probably celebrating his victory right now. Back home, Rico's room looked exactly the same, except for the absence of him. Mom had already started talking about maybe using it as an office, moving forward like Rico had never existed. Dad seemed uncomfortable with how quickly she was erasing him, but didn't say anything. I spent that night researching the group home's visiting policies. The application was 12 pages long, required references and background checks, and a statement of purpose. Visiting hours were limited to weekends, supervised, No phones allowed. It would take weeks to get approved, if they approved me at all. School the next day felt surreal. Zach's campaign had worked so perfectly that most students didn't even notice Rico was gone. Teachers moved on with their lessons. Kids gossiped about normal teenage drama. The world kept spinning without him. Zach approached me at lunch, with fake concern, asking if I was okay after my friend had to leave. The performance was flawless, but I saw the satisfaction beneath it. He'd won completely, had removed Rico from our lives while maintaining his image as a worried peer. I realized then that Zach's victory was also his prison. He'd spent 2 years planning revenge, had moved his entire family, and orchestrated an elaborate campaign of destruction. Now that Rico was gone, what did he have left? The emptiness in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking suggested he was already discovering that answer. The next few weeks blurred together. I submitted my visiting application and waited. My parents moved on with disturbing speed, relieved to have their normal life back. Teachers stopped asking about Rico. Even the kids who'd spread rumors found new targets for their gossip. I got a letter from Rico after 3 weeks. His handwriting was careful, probably monitored by staff. He said the group home wasn't too bad, that he was in therapy and doing school online. Between the lines, I could read the truth, that he was surviving, not living, just like always. My visiting application was denied. The reason given was vague, something about ongoing concerns and best interests of the minor. I knew Zach's family had probably made more calls, filed more reports, ensured Rico would remain isolated even in the group home. I wrote letters, instead, sending them weekly, even though Rico could rarely write back. I told him about school, about my parents, about anything except how empty everything felt without him. I didn't mention Zach. Didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was still affecting our lives. 2 months after Rico left, I heard Marcel had been released from residential treatment. The information came through school gossip. Whispers about how he'd moved in with extended family in another state. I wondered if he knew what his brother had done in his name. Zach's behavior changed after Marcel left. Without his brother as justification for his actions, the weight of what he'd done seemed to settle on him. He became withdrawn, stopped, maintaining his perfect student facade. His parents looked older, worn down by the cost of enabling their son's obsession. I saw Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store one day. She started to approach me, then changed her mind and hurried away. The confident woman who'd orchestrated meetings and made concerned calls was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't meet my eyes. Spring came, and with it, acceptance letters for early admission programs. My grades had recovered, but the enthusiasm I'd once felt for college was muted. Every achievement felt hollow when I thought about Rico aging out of the system, with nowhere to go. I kept writing letters even when Rico's responses became less frequent. The group home had strict mail policies, and I suspected not all my letters reached him, but I kept writing anyway, maintaining the connection Zach had tried so hard to sever. One day, a letter came with Rico's familiar handwriting, but a different return address. He'd been moved to a transitional living program, a step toward independence. He was learning job skills, saving money, preparing for aging out of the system. His words were hopeful but cautious, afraid to believe things might actually improve. I applied to visit his new placement and was approved. The train ride took 3 hours, but when I saw him waiting at the station, it was worth every minute. He looked older, but also somehow younger, like the weight he'd carried for so long was finally starting to lift. We spent the day walking around his new city, talking about everything and nothing. He showed me the restaurant where he worked part-time, the community college where he was taking classes. It wasn't the life he should have had, but it was his, built despite everyone who tried to tear him down. Rico asked about Zach once near the end of my visit. I told him the truth, that Zach had gotten what he wanted, but found it empty. That his family was fractured, that Marcel was trying to heal far away from all of them. Rico just nodded. No satisfaction in his expression, just sadness for everyone involved. When it was time to leave, Rico walked me back to the train station. He thanked me for not giving up on him, for seeing him as a person when everyone else saw a problem. I told him he'd never been a problem, just a kid trying to survive in a world that made survival difficult. The train pulled away, and I watched Rico disappear into the crowd. He wasn't the scared 14-year-old who'd arrived at our house anymore. He was 18 now, about to age out of the system that had failed him so many times. But he was also strong, resilient, and finally free to write his own story. I never saw Zach again after graduation. I heard he went to college out of state, studying psychology, of all things. Maybe he was trying to understand what had driven him to such cruelty, or maybe he was learning new ways to manipulate people. I hoped it was the former, but suspected the latter. My parents never fostered again. They occasionally asked about Rico, but their relief when I said he was doing okay told me they'd never really understood what we'd lost when he left. They'd seen the disruption to their lives, but not the person at the center of it. I kept all of Rico's letters in a box under my bed. Sometimes I'd reread them, tracking his progress from group home to transitional living to independence. Each one was proof that Zach had failed in his ultimate goal. He'd removed Rico from our home, but he hadn't destroyed him. Years later, I got a message on social media. Rico had found me, wanted to reconnect properly. He was 25 now, working as a counselor at a youth shelter. He'd turned his pain into purpose, helping kids who reminded him of himself. We met for coffee, and it felt like no time had passed at all. He told me about the notebook I'd given him, how he still had it, read it whenever the world felt too heavy. Those observations I'd written had reminded him that someone had seen his truth when lies were easier to believe. It had made the difference between giving up and going on. We talked about Zach, about Marcel, about the whole twisted situation that had shaped both our lives. Rico didn't hate them, which surprised me. He understood that hurt people, that Zach had been a child too, poisoned by grief, and enabled by adults who should have helped him heal instead. I asked Rico if he ever thought about what would have happened if Zach hadn't targeted him, if he'd been allowed to stay with my family. He smiled sadly and said he'd learned not to think about what-ifs. The life he'd built was real, was his, and that was enough. We stayed in touch after that. Real friendship now instead of the desperate connection forged in crisis. Rico invited me to his wedding a few years later, introduced me as the sister who'd fought for him when no one else would. I cried through the entire ceremony. The last I heard about Zach was from Marcel, who reached out years after everything happened. He said Zach was in therapy, finally dealing with the grief and anger he'd carried for so long. Their parents had divorced, the weight of their enabling finally breaking them. Marcel himself was doing well, had become an advocate for foster youth. Sometimes I drive past my old house and remember that scared boy who'd sat silently at our dinner table. I think about how differently things could have gone if we'd just seen him instead of his labels. But mostly I think about how he survived despite us all. Built a life from the ashes of what others had burned. Rico texts me sometimes, usually when he's helped another kid escape a bad situation. He says I taught him that one person believing in you can make all the difference. I tell him he taught me that strength comes in many forms, and the quietest people often carry the most. The system that failed Rico is still broken. Kids still get labeled and discarded. Foster families still give up when things get hard, and people like Zach still find ways to weaponize bureaucracy against the vulnerable. But there are also people like adult Rico now, who understand from experience and work to make things better. I never became the lawyer or doctor my parents expected. Instead, I became a social worker, specifically working with foster youth. My parents don't understand why I'd choose such a difficult, underpaid career. They never understood that. Rico changed the trajectory of my life as much as Zach changed his. Every case I take, I remember Rico's empty eyes in that CPS meeting room. I remember how the system saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a child who needed love. I try to be the advocate he didn't have, the voice that speaks truth when lies are more convenient. Rico and I don't talk about that year much anymore. We've both moved forward, built lives, found happiness despite the trauma. But sometimes when we're together, I catch him checking over his shoulder, and I know he's looking for someone watching, waiting to tear down what he's built. The truth is, Zach won the battle, but lost the war. He got Rico removed from our home, destroyed his sense of safety, weaponized the system against him. But he didn't break Rico's spirit, didn't stop him from becoming the remarkable person he was always meant to be. I learned that year that cruelty can wear many faces. That the most dangerous bullies are the ones who convince others they're the heroes. I learned that systems meant to protect can be turned into weapons, that good intentions mean nothing without the courage to act on them. But I also learned that resilience is stronger than revenge, that one person's belief can sustain someone through impossible circumstances. Rico survived not because the system worked, but in spite of its failures, held up by the few people who saw him clearly. Looking back, I wish I'd been braver, smarter, more effective in fighting Zach's campaign. I wish my parents had been stronger, that the system had been better, that Rico had never needed to be so resilient. But wishes don't change the past, only inform the future. Rico is 32 now, married with 2 kids of his own. He sends me pictures sometimes, his daughter learning to ride a bike, his son's first day of school. Normal, beautiful moments that once seemed impossible for the boy everyone had written off. He named his daughter Hope and his son Marcus after Marcel. When I asked him why, he said he wanted to remember that good can come from pain, that Marcel had tried to protect him even when it cost everything. It was Rico's way of honoring the complicated truth of their shared history. I think about Zach sometimes, wonder if he ever found peace with what he'd done. Part of me hopes he did, that therapy helped him process his grief in healthier ways. But mostly I try not to think about him at all. He took up too much space in our lives already. The oak tree where everything started still stands behind my old school. Sometimes when I visit my parents, I drive by and remember 2 scared teenagers trying to protect each other from forces they didn't understand. The tree has grown taller, stronger, weathering storms and seasons. Rico told me once that he thinks about that tree too, how it was there before Zach's campaign and remained after. He said it reminded him that some things endure despite attempts to destroy them, that survival itself can be a form of victory. I keep a photo on my desk of Rico at his wedding, smiling with genuine joy. When my cases feel hopeless, when the system seems too broken to fix, I look at that photo and remember one person believed in him when no one else would. And sometimes that's all it takes. The notebook I gave Rico all those years ago is framed in his office now. He showed it to me on my last visit. Pages yellowed, but still readable. Every observation I'd made about his kindness, his strength, his quiet courage preserved behind glass. Proof that someone had seen him truly. He uses it when counseling kids who think they're worthless. Shows them that someone once wrote these things about him when the whole world said he was dangerous. He tells them that their truth exists regardless of who believes it. That they are more than the worst things said about them. I've never told Rico that I burned all the evidence I'd gathered against Zach. He doesn't need to know how close I came to becoming like the person I was fighting. Some truths are better left unspoken, some battles better left unfought. What matters is that Rico survived, thrived, and became someone who helps others do the same. What matters is that Zach's cruelty didn't win, even when it seemed unstoppable. What matters is that 2 teenagers who tried to protect each other grew into adults who protect others. The group home where Rico lived was shut down 5 years ago for violations. The transitional program that helped him find independence expanded to 3 locations. The world changes slowly in small victories and major setbacks, but it does change. Sometimes Rico and I meet at that coffee shop where we reconnected, and we talk about our work, our families, our lives. We're proof that survival is possible, that cruelty doesn't have to have the last word. We're living evidence that one person's belief can make all the difference. And sometimes on quiet nights, I think about all the Ricos out there who don't have someone to believe in them. I think about all the Zachs whose pain gets weaponized instead of healed. I think about all the systems that fail the people they're meant to protect. But then I remember that scared 14-year-old who became a counselor, who turned his pain into purpose. I remember that change is possible, even when it seems impossibly slow. I remember that we all have the power to see people truly, to believe in them when no one else will. Rico taught me that strength isn't about winning every battle. Sometimes, it's about surviving long enough to build something better from the ruins. Sometimes it's about refusing to let cruelty make you cruel. Sometimes it's about believing in someone else's truth when the whole world says you're wrong.